Greetings, everyone. I'm so glad you've chosen to join our little learning community for this short course in evaluating research. I'm hoping we'll have a really good time over the next 5 weeks and hopefully we'll all learn something. So one of the things I want to cover in this first lecture is a discussion of what we mean by science, what we mean by evidence, and how that relates to the appropriate science that we want to apply. We want to talk about the financial planning profession's body of knowledge, the degree to which it's been influenced by science or been formed through the scientific method, and the degree to which it has a long ways to go, and what we might do to take it where it needs to go. So, our body of knowledge is a mix of best practices that have come from trial and error, the accumulation of personal observation, intuition. That's, I would propose, is the majority of our body of knowledge. That doesn't mean there aren't some best practices that have not been validated through formal empirical research and the methods of science. But I would propose that that represents the minority right now of the financial planning profession's body of knowledge, and that we really need to shift that balance if we're going to move this profession forward in the direction it needs to go. So let's talk about what we mean by science. There are a number of different definitions of science possible. I happen to like this very compact version. It says very simply, science is the pursuit of knowledge and understanding of the natural and social world following a systematic methodology based on evidence. That's a very brief statement, but there's so much contained there. I'd like to take just a minute to unpack the contents of this wonderful statement. So first of all, science is the pursuit of knowledge and understanding of the natural and social world. This is a point that I think is very important. Science is not just focused solely on the study of the stars and the planets and biology and physics, although in many cases that's come to symbolize science in many people's minds. But the scientific method is equally at home in the social world, in the social sciences, including business and finance and financial planning. So the pursuit of knowledge and understanding in the natural and social world, including the world of financial planning, following a systematic methodology based on evidence. Systematic methodology. There is a scientific method, and it is applied the same no matter what realm you're exploring. And it's based on evidence. Now, the type of evidence will vary, and the amount of evidence that may be available for any given question or in any given realm may vary. But nonetheless, you're always looking for evidence, and you're testing that evidence. You're testing your propositions using that evidence via a systematic method, the scientific method. So the scientific method typically encompasses two different sorts of reasoning, two different branches of reasoning. The first is deductive reasoning. And deductive reasoning is a form of reasoning that proceeds from the general to the particular. And the way this works is that a self-evident proposition will be stated. And then we deduce, we reason from that self-evident proposition to some particular conclusion. So for example, a very simple example, all penguins are birds. Self-evident proposition. Well, from that we can reason our way to the notion that all birds are animals, and further to the conclusion that all penguins must be animals. This is also a form of reasoning that's known as a syllogism. The other major form of reasoning that's used in science is inductive reasoning. And inductive reasoning proceeds from the particular to the general. It proceeds from individual observations that over time seem to accumulate to some belief, that will accumulate to some belief about an underlying mechanism. So we might observe hundreds of different species of penguins and see that so far every single species of penguin that's been observed is a swimmer. So from these individual observations that have accumulated over time, we conclude that all species of penguins are swimmers. So we start with individual observations, and the accumulation of those individual observations leads us to a conclusion or a proposition of a much more general nature. So when we think about the best practices in financial planning, and I'm not going to go through an exhaustive list, and you'll have read the accompanying article to this and seen some examples, but the best practices in financial planning clearly arise from both sources of reasoning, or both types of reasoning. We can see instances where there are some things that we do as financial planners that have become the best practice because they're self-evidently true. And there are other things, and this is where you get into some variety, but from one planner to the next, where someone has a series of observations. They observe something with a whole series of clients, for example. I may have advised hundreds of clients, many hundreds of clients over the last 20, 25 years, and found that every time I asked an open-ended question, I got a better result. I got more information. It was useful to the financial planning process. And so I conclude that that type of questioning is the best way to uncover information from a client. That's an accumulation of individual observations that have added up to some conclusion. The thing that is observable, however, in our body of knowledge is that in many cases, if not most cases, our best practices cease at that point. We either have adopted a best practice because it seems self-evidently true, or we have accumulated many observations over many clients over many years that seem to add up to a conclusion, and therefore we build a best practice around that, and we stop, and we don't test it. And this is where the next step lies for our profession, is actually putting an empirical foundation under those best practices that have accumulated through practice over time. This is a statement I love from Albert Einstein because it summarizes why our best practices have arisen the way they do. They've arisen through inductive and deductive reasoning because this is just the way human beings think. And so Einstein rightly observed that the whole of science is nothing more than a refinement of everyday thinking. Inductive and deductive reasoning are a natural way that humans think. The key word here is refinement. We need to take that next step. We need to take that natural mode of human thinking and take the extra refinement of subjecting it to the scientific process, the scientific method, to the empirical techniques that will allow us to put that sound foundation under those best practices that seem to make sense. So, well, I guess I've just said this, so I won't say more. So let's talk about what we mean by evidence. Evidence is something that is derived from taking propositions that have been formally tested using the methods of science. Now, the thing that we'll talk about a lot over the course of the next 5 weeks is the appropriate standards of evidence. Because what we're going to find is that in the different realms that concern financial planners, the standards of evidence that are available to us are going to vary. There's some realms where there's very little evidence. And in some realms there's very little evidence possible. And so we do the best we can. We conduct the best tests we can with the available evidence, and we arrive at the best conclusions we can, and therefore the best practices, if you will. And in other realms, there's a lot more evidence available. I mean, one of the things that we'll discuss over the course of this next 5 weeks is the fact that there are a lot of techniques that are widely used in our profession that have been published in our journals that are based on someone's belief and observations, but that readily give rise to testable hypotheses, where readily think of 5 testable hypotheses, but no one's bothered to actually formulate those, gather the evidence, and test them. So the whole notion of evidence-based financial planning has 3 parts. On the one hand, it's the use of the conscious choice to use best practices that have been subjected to some formal standards of evidence. It's a further commitment to having the ability to identify the difference between a best practice that is founded on evidence and one that's merely anecdotal. And that's why you're all here. One of the purposes of this course is to help us all become better at identifying research-based evidence and then further, identifying propositions that are based on research versus those that are not, those that are just opinion. And furthermore, going to the next step and actually assessing the quality of that research. Is it compelling? Did they follow the right methodology? Was their methodology compelling? Are their results compelling? Are there obvious applications to my practice? And finally, the third piece is a commitment as a profession to fostering more research. So I have to just jump in here and make it really clear that we're talking about science and not scientism. Scientism is that's when we make a fetish of science, where we worship anything that's resembling scientific. That's not the goal here. The goal here is to use science as a tool, and to use it as a tool that's applied and practiced with humility. The scope of science is actually much narrower than many people realize, and science at its best requires that we approach it with humility, because the realm of questions that are encompassed by science is very small when properly understood. And Karl Popper was one of the great philosophers of science, of the methods of science, and he gave us some great insights into how to think about the scientific enterprise. He's known as the father of the falsificationist approach to science. And it derives from statements like this. He basically said, no proposition can be termed scientific unless it is at least in principle falsifiable. If you make some proposition that is immune to any kind of formal testing, there is no evidence that could be gathered to test or falsify this proposition, then it's not a scientific proposition. Now, that's not to say that it's not true. I might believe that my daily meditations increase world peace. That's my belief. It might be true. You don't know that it's not true, but it's not testable. It's not testable. And therefore, it falls outside the realm of science. And because this is where I think you get into some difficulty, where people think that somehow science and religion, for example, are at odds with each other. At its best, science does not say that. I'm not saying there haven't been individual scientists who maybe haven't taken some controversial positions with respect to religion or religious belief. But in reality, a purist, when it comes to science, would merely say religious propositions are not true or false as far as the scientists are concerned, or as far as science is concerned. They're merely outside the realm of science. They fall outside anything that science can address. So this is the best approach to take when thinking about science. It's with humility. It's with an understanding of the narrow scope of science, and the idea that science is not at odds with things that fall outside the realm of science. It merely is clear about which propositions are scientific and which are not. So Popper again, good tests kill flawed theories. We remain alive to guess again. The key here being, we're, as scientists, or as the consumers of scientific output, of research-based writing, we're always open to new ideas, supplanting old ones. That's the nature of science. And finally, our knowledge could only be finite, while our ignorance must necessarily be infinite. And the realm of propositions that can be tested at any given point in time is very finite. And we have to be concerned with what we can observe, what we can test, and be clear that the things we can't test are not necessarily untrue, but they're outside the scientific enterprise. So I want to touch on a case study that actually, among other things, it addressed one of the CFP board standards, one of the CFP board's practice standards, 201. And this is about establishing the scope of the engagement. And it's as you can see, I'm going to read it. The financial planning practitioner and the client shall mutually define the client's personal and financial goals, needs, and priorities that are relevant to the scope of the engagement before any recommendation is made and or implemented. It goes on to say that this is being done in order to arrive at such a definition. The practitioner will need to explore the client's values, attitudes, expectations, and time horizons as they affect the client's goals, needs, and priorities. That the role of the practitioner is to facilitate the goal-setting process in order to clarify with the client goals and objectives. And here's the why. Goals and objectives provide focus, purpose, vision, and direction for the financial planning process. Now, if you look at the history of CFP Board's practice standards, you can see that, and CFP Board actually describes them this way, that they were formed through a consensus process in which experienced practitioners came together and came to a consensus about the best way to work with clients and the reasons for that. However, they weren't tested scientifically. This was a classic example of experienced practitioners coming together in work groups and saying, here's what we believe based on our personal and collective experience is the best way to work with clients for the following reasons. Well, Anderson and Sharp came along in 2008 and did some research that addressed this very process. Now they did it within the kind of the life planning context, but it was really focused on communication and the types of communication and engagement that clients most valued. And they were using a construct where they were measuring, and we'll actually see this in some of the papers we read. This, in fact, will be one of the papers you'll read in future weeks. But their objective variable was client trust and relationship commitment. Now, it turns out that there's come to be a lot of research in the area of financial planning that use client trust and relationship commitment as the research variable, as the objective variable, if you will. And there's good reason for that. You know, financial planning is a professional practice that has high credence qualities. And high credence qualities means it's difficult to observe the quality of the advice even after it's been delivered. Think about it. Clients come to us asking us to help them achieve goals that are decades in the future. They have no way of assessing whether or not the advice we give them today is actually good advice or the best advice. And so they look for secondary markers. As a researcher, if you were trying to determine the effectiveness of a financial planning engagement, you need something you could observe in the moment. And it turns out that these characteristics of client trust and relationship commitment, which can be observed in the moment, are big predictors of a successful financial planning engagement. Among other things, research has shown that when clients exhibit high trust and relationship commitment, they have a higher propensity to reveal personal and financial information. They have a higher propensity to actually implement financial planning recommendations. They engage in functional conflict, which means when conflicts do arise, they have a high propensity to work through them successfully with their advisor. They have a higher propensity to stay with the advisor, which means that financial planning strategies can be implemented over time. And they have a higher propensity to make referrals, which is perhaps a secondary characteristic. But all of the preceding ones you could see are characteristics of a successful financial planning engagement. If clients tell us more about their financial circumstances, more about their personal circumstances, they have a higher propensity to actually implement our recommendations, and they have a higher propensity to work through the rough spots that inevitably arise. We know that that financial planning engagement is going to be more successful. So that was one of the testing points that Anderson and Sharp were using. This was Carol Anderson and Deanna Sharp. Carol Anderson of Money Quotient, and Deanna Sharp, who's a professional academic. So they tested communication topics, communication tasks, and communication tasks, communication topics, and communication skills. And what they found is that clients put a huge value on there being a systematic process for uncovering their goals and values. That they put a huge value on the planner actually being willing and able to initiate difficult conversations about money where the emotional content may have been high. They placed a high value on the planner actually seeking to know about them as human beings, as well as the maximum information about their stuff, about their financial resources. So so Anderson and Sharp, they had an opportunity to gather survey data both from financial planners and from clients. So I mentioned some of the findings from clients. Clients like a systematic process for uncovering goals and values. Clients put a high value on their advisor being prepared to engage and facilitate in difficult conversations about money. And those are associated with higher trust and commitment. So then when they surveyed financial planners, and they asked them to answer the question or to evaluate the statement, I use a systematic process for helping my clients, they found that more than 40% did not agree with that statement. And the further statement, I use a goal-setting process to help my clients establish meaningful personal financial goals and objectives. Again, more than 40%, more than 4 in 10, said that they did not. So this brings up some really interesting questions. If the CFP board's practice standard that says it's important for the planner to engage in this systematic process for uncovering goals and values and aspirations is an important part of establishing a successful financial planning relationship. And now the likes of Anderson and Sharp, and they're not the only ones. We'll review actually a number of pieces of research literature related to this. But Anderson and Sharp in this example, they've evaluated that and they found that actually this is true. Clients not only place a high value on that, but that they exhibit a higher level of trust and commitment where that's present in the financial planning engagement. And again, other research has shown that when they exhibit a high degree of trust and commitment, it leads to characteristics that are markers of more successful financial planning engagements. So it'll be interesting to see if things change as this kind of evidence emerges. Now this relates to some of my own research. This was actually related to my doctoral research, where I was looking at the different ways in which financial planners go about developing financial planning strategies for clients, the different modes of strategy making that they might engage in. And I actually posited a model that had 5 different modes of strategy making that ranged, that actually fell along a spectrum of planner engagement versus client engagement. And the 2 extremes are not present here. You know, on the left of this spectrum, there would be what I called the planner-driven mode, and on the far right would be the client-driven mode. And in the planner-driven mode, the planner, absolutely sets the agenda. The planner does everything almost without the client. And you know these circumstances that probably in some ways represents the majority of the financial services world out there, where the planner has a set of solutions and becomes like that old story about someone whose only tool is a hammer. Pretty soon everything starts to look like a nail. In the planner-driven mode, which, as I said, is probably we all know is pretty dominant out there, the planner has a finite number of solutions. The planner is merely going to fit the client into one of those finite solutions. The client has almost no input into the process. At the other extreme, again, not illustrated here, the client-driven mode, that's just about validation. That's where the client is going about making their own decisions to a significant degree. And then they're just, if they have any contact point with a planner, it's merely to get some validation for something they've already done. So the client dominates that mode, and the planner has almost no engagement. And you see this, there are a number of different services, for example, online, where someone can literally buy a planner's time by the minute in order to have questions answered or validate things they've done. Well, I was also testing my model against client trust and relationship commitment. And those two outlying modes, as you might imagine, because they were so unbalanced, those strategy-making modes exhibited very low levels of client trust and relationship commitment, and therefore you would predict very, very low success rates for those engagements. The three central modes that involved a more balanced mix of client and planner engagement, the data-driven mode, which was very much kind of the traditional mode of financial planning. The client enters, certainly at the degree of revealing what their financial circumstances are and revealing what their personal goals are. But for the rest, the planner is using traditional quantitative-based tools in order to come up with answers for the client. So it's really, the client's involved, but it's dominated by the planner. Policy-driven mode, for those of you who are familiar with the work Elisa and I and others have done in policy-based financial planning, this is a much more balanced mode because policies are compact decision rules that ideally embody both financial planning best practices and the client's personal vision and goals and values. And if the client doesn't see themselves and what's important to them and their vision and values embedded and reflected in those policies, they're not effective touchstones. They're not effective decision tools. And so this involves a very balanced approach between planner and client, where the subsequent decision rules, these policies, are fully balanced and fully reflective of the planner's wisdom and the client's personal values and vision. The relationship-driven mode is kind of, I'm going to say it's kind of like the life planning mode taken to the extreme, where it's really just about deep discovery and it's about the client's interior life, and there's less financial planning taking place there. So it can be valuable as an input to the rest, but it can become too extreme. Nonetheless, these three modes have the highest, exhibit the highest degrees of client trust and relationship commitment. The policy-driven actually exhibiting the highest of all three. But it can be shown that each of them is important. The clients value all three. All three are necessary if the financial planner is going to have the sufficient skill set, if you will, or if they're going to be engaging the client in a way that has the greatest probability of affecting positive change in the client's life and helping create the resilience that allow clients to deal with environmental changes that may be imposed upon them. But here's what's interesting. When in subsequent research, in postdoctoral research, into the actual blend of skill sets and approaches that clients used, here's what I found. What I found is that rather than seeing a blend across all practitioners, what I tended to see was skewing. What I tended to see was, I didn't illustrate this here, I wish I had, but if you take individual planners, what you would find is they had what I'm going to call a strategic comfort zone, where they would tend to be skewed one way or the other. Many planners would be skewed towards the data-driven mode, and you'd see a big, they'd be very high in data-driven and lower in policy-driven and very low in relationship-driven. And then other planners would have a huge skew towards relationship-driven mode and score much lower on the data-driven mode. And so you find that planners as a practice don't seek out the balance. They tend to have a strategic comfort zone where they tend to be gearheads or they tend to be focused on the relationship, but they don't seek the balance. Interestingly, I've presented, I have a presentation called Financial Planner Strategist that I've based on this particular data, this research, and I've presented it a half a dozen times or more at various conferences. And what I found is when financial planners in general, when they see this, they actually embrace it. And they say, oh, you know, I tend to score, and I actually, in many cases, I've actually allowed the attendees to use the instrument that measures these ahead of the meeting so I could actually show them where they score. And the ones that tend to be skewed towards the relationship mode go, oh, you know what, the next conference I go to, I'm going to look at some of the more technical sessions. I'm going to try and balance. And the ones that tend to be skewed more towards the quantitative, towards the data-driven mode, well, they say, oh, you know, I'm going to actually make a conscious effort to focus more on some of the sessions that are focused on behavioral finance and deep discovery and the interior realm so I could become more balanced there. So I think I've covered this. So the point is that there is some research out there that suggests the virtues of a more balanced mode if you're going to have a successful client engagement, the most successful possible client engagement. But it's a matter of you know, evidence that didn't exist before. And so people found their strategic comfort zone. And hopefully as some of this evidence continues to mount, planners will actually use almost a dynamic scorecard to decide whether or not they need to top up some of their other strategic modes. So I've covered this. I won't spend time on this. So if we look at other examples in our profession where there is, where we're using techniques that are in fact founded on some good science, on some good evidence. Monte Carlo analysis, Monte Carlo simulations. You know, I had the privilege last year of presenting the P. Campaign Junior Award posthumously to Lynn Hopewell, who was the one back in the 90s who introduced stochastic modeling, including Monte Carlo simulations, into our profession. I know that as we think about it, it seems amazing that it was the mid-90s before stochastic modeling formally entered our profession because it's such a natural fit. But you know, it took a visionary like Lynn Hopewell to see the connection, introduce it, and then make it a part of our toolkit. Safe withdrawal policies, such as the work of Guyton and Klinger, 2006, which is another one of the articles we're going to read. Standard finance, obviously a lot of that's been absorbed. Behavioral finance, I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. Communication theory, there's a lot of that's embedded in this client trust and relationship commitment work I've mentioned. And risk tolerance. I just grabbed a couple of items that are on my radar screen where I'd like to see more research. Alternative investments, I don't think there's a good theory there, and maybe there's not a good theory to be had. I might even make that case. Risk perception or risk capacity, you know, we've done pretty well in terms of risk tolerance, but when it comes to risk perception or risk capacity, there's a lot of work done, I think, to put a more empirical foundation under our understanding. You know, Phenometrica has a 25-year database that's been used recently for some really good research on risk tolerance. But risk capacity and risk perception are newer concepts. Well, risk perception especially are newer concepts where I think there's a lot of work to do. Long-term care, risk management in general. You know, these are things where even though I have taught the risk management course in the financial planning curriculum before, there's some good theory there, but I think there's a lot of room for expansion, especially in the financial planning context. So just briefly, I want to look at the 6-step process of financial planning and talk about where the science is. You know, in establishing and defining the client-planner relationship, there's a lot of formal work that's been done in communication theory, psychology, and sociology. In gathering client data, again, there are a lot of research that's looked at trust and commitment, neuroscience, behavioral finance, analyzing and evaluating financial status. A lot of that's basic finance, financial statement analysis, and so forth. But developing and presenting financial planning recommendations and alternatives. You know, this brings into play economics, finance, strategy or strategic thinking. Strategy was the key area of study that I pursued in developing my own doctoral research. Monte Carlo analysis, scenario planning, talked to, Dennis Stearns about that. We may read some of his work. And risk management. Those are all parts of that step. Implementing the financial planning recommendations, obviously investment theory comes into play, behavioral finance, what I like to call decision architecture. Policy-based financial planning is a form of decision architecture, or what Thaler and Sunstein call choice architecture. Monitoring the financial planning recommendations. That we're cycling back through all of those bodies of scientific inquiry. So I like to think of the sciences as encompassing both the interior and the exterior. The exterior sciences are what we first think of: finance, economics, investment theory, and so forth. But the interior sciences are present as well: psychology, neuroscience, behavioral finance. So, while a lot of people over the years have talked about the art and science of financial planning, as if the art is the kind of thing we just do by the seat of our pants, I would suggest a different way of putting it. The art of financial planning is the artful application of both the interior and exterior sciences of financial planning. So the art of financial planning is not the seat of the pants thing. It's not the intuitive thing. It's not whatever we want it to be. It's the artful application of the best of the interior and exterior sciences that are available to us. So now I have my own approach to reading research, and I'm going to ask us in the next 5 weeks to use both my approach and the one in the text. The textbook author has a similar approach. It's slightly different, answering basically the same questions. When we read a piece of research-based literature, we have to ask ourselves, what's the problem or question? If it's research-based, there was a problem or question at the heart of it that the researchers were seeking to answer. How is the problem conceptualized? What are the key findings from prior research? Because research almost invariably builds on the work of others that have gone before. What methodology was used to test the question? And this is one of the things we'll spend a lot of time on in the next 5 weeks, is understanding the different methodologies that are appropriate to different research questions. What were the results of the testing? Were the results compelling? And this is going to be one of the biggest parts of our dialogue over the next 5 weeks, is discussions of how we determine if the results were compelling. What are the practical applications, assuming that the results were compelling? And will this change the way we practice? And if so, how? If we find compelling results, what are the practical implications of those compelling results? And how will we incorporate that into our own practice and our own work with clients in order to be better? So the other piece, that third piece I mentioned earlier, was that having a commitment to supporting the practitioner-academic partnership. Because the thing is, and this was an academic who actually gave me this image of, you got your chocolate and my peanut butter, you got my peanut butter and my chocolate, the Reese's cup shtick. But the reality is that financial planners are working on the front line. They know what the critical questions of the day are, but they don't really know how to conduct research. Academics are trained in conducting research, but they're not on the front line. They don't know the critical question. So the academic and practitioner world have to have deep connections so that the academics can understand the important questions, and the financial planners can be in touch with the results of research that's addressing those important questions and know what those compelling outcomes are. So where do we go from here? Commitment to an evidence-based body of knowledge, identification and training around existing science and tools, formal training for practitioners in evaluating evidence derived from formal research. That's why you're all here. Thank you for being here, by the way. And more practitioner-academic partnerships to conduct practice-oriented research. I should mention that the Financial Planning Association has recently created a new knowledge circle called Theory into Practice, which, again, we'll talk about more in the coming weeks. But it's designed to bring together the practitioner and the academic community to do just this. So thank you, and I'm just looking forward to the next 5 weeks. Thanks for being here.